The New York Times has obtained and published previously never-before-seen photos of the first prisoners detained at Guantanamo Bay. Taken in early 2002, the photos were intended to give senior military leadership a closer look at the prison's detention and interrogation operations. The Times reports that if taken by news photographers today, these images of Guantanamo would not clear the base's current censorship policy.
Just this week, legislation cutting $100 billion from the country's defense budget was introduced by Democratic Representatives Mark Pocan and Barbara Lee. Pocan said in a statement, quote, "The amount of money the defense industry convinces Congress to spend each year doesn't protect us from real threats like climate change, pandemics, or cyber attacks. It only lines contractors' pockets. Just imagine for once if we let the world in funding peace and not war." Yeah, so these photographs were revealing, in part because it's the first time we've seen these kind of pictures. And there were the subtext, the political context of these was really interesting. So there was one photograph that people were talking about where one of the guards had put a flag in the blindfolded, handcuffed prisoner's hand. And it was really evocative of, the pictures we got out of Abu Ghraib and kind of the misconduct that was happening there. And now all of these years, 20 plus years out, when so few people, it's like a number in the teens that have actually been prosecuted. There's been so little to come of it. It was such an outrage in earlier election cycles. I remember when I was in college, it was like the crux of a lot of our political activism and resistance to the Bush administration, that it still persists, and that there doesn't seem to be the kind of political engagement around this issue that there used to be. Obama ran on closing Guantanamo. To have these pictures come out now is a kind of stark reminder of how little things have changed. Oh,
absolutely. And it's also a stark reminder of the incredible short-term memory problem we have in politics, where we have some really horrific evils perpetrated by the U.S. government, even to this day, and people deprived of their due process and deprived of their day in court. And yet, for whatever reason, people don't really care about this too much. And honestly, this is, I think, a testament to the power of photojournalism to some degree, because I was also, when researching this segment a little bit, I was noticing that Time magazine also sent some photojournalists to cover, what limited things they could access at Guantanamo, I think around 2013. And I mean, the photos that emerged from that, although they didn't have as many people in them, we're talking 6 by 8 foot metal cages kept outdoors, almost akin to what you'd see at a dog kennel or a municipal animal shelter. There's something absolutely striking about these images, and it's horrifying that they capture the public imagination for a very short amount of time, but it isn't something that sort of lingers in our political discourse today.
Yeah, it does feel like a bigger problem politically, that our appetite for sticking with a story for a long time is little to none. I mean, during the Trump years, liberals lamented that they didn't seem to be able to get a story to stick. Part of it does seem to me to be rooted in this distrust of the media culture more broadly. That, why it's about who you trust as a figurehead as opposed to the underlying story, because people's news sources are so bifurcated at this point, and there's an almost defensiveness, and I feel this myself, and I have to respond to it and try to get myself in line, a defensiveness to want to defend your position because the stakes seem so high, and there's very little in terms of having a conversation about how we want our country to run and what we want the world to look like, and how we can build toward those kinds of shared goals, because I do think there are a great deal of national values that we do share, and people see pictures like this that do seem to be objective evidence and do have a lot of simpatico about distaste for the fact that that's what our country is up to.
Republican Mayra Flores has won in a special election in a Texas district, defeating her Democratic opponent. Now, the interesting thing here is this is a district that was blue, that Joe Biden won by a number of points, and that is a massive majority Hispanic district. Flores is actually born in Mexico, I think the first Mexican-born congresswoman. And this district has been redrawn, so she's actually going to have to, it's a kind of weird circumstance, she's going to have to run for re-election again, and I think under the new district it's more favorable even so to Democrats, so we'll see. But as a kind of indicator of where things are right now, easily, she's triumphing easily in a
13 points, I think.
Yeah, that went to Biden, and showing the problems that Democrats are going to have and are having with Hispanic voters in particular.
Yeah, I mean, both candidates, I believe, in this race were Hispanic, but this really throws a monkey wrench in the Democratic notion that magically running Hispanic people or is going to get you to win in Hispanic districts, or that Hispanic people are naturally always going to align with the Democratic Party. This was the really undersold story, I'm sorry, of the 2020 Democratic primary. But Bernie Sanders' ability to do well with Hispanic voters, because certain issues like healthcare and a minimum wage are such huge drivers. When he won Nevada, in part because the culinary union rank and file flipped, disregarded leadership and said, no, we want to go with Bernie Sanders instead of being, going with the kind of a corporate elite, Democrat elite led leadership. It was a huge sea change and really reflected the fact that if you deliver and you give, provide a populist working class platform to people, it doesn't matter, Democrat, Republican, Latino voters are much more in flux. And I haven't been following this race closely, but I'd be really curious to see what kind of messaging was going on down there in Texas, and whether or not the Democratic candidate was running on being a Democrat, or whether or not he was running on some of these substantive policies that working people really need.
Well, so Flores did tout that her husband was a Border Patrol agent, so, no illusions there about she's a Republican and what she thinks about immigration. Democrats have pretended that just kind of scaring Hispanic voters, just saying, well, Republicans are racist and they hate immigrants, that's doing the work. That's enough. Yeah. And it's just, it could not be clearer that that is not working. Actually, even some Hispanic voters want stronger immigration policies. Sure. They have a range of opinions on the issues. Right. They might want stronger ones than I do. I'm for immigration, but it's just not this monolith. It's not the only issue to them. It's not necessarily the most important issue, and it's not an issue necessarily where they all agree. So it's just a losing strategy to just focus on that and say, oh, that'll be good enough.
Yeah. Well, like a lot of stories these days, this one has an Elon Musk tie-in. Mm-hmm. What is that, Robbie?
So Elon Musk voted in this election. He lives in this district, and he said that he voted for Flores, the Republican, for the first time in his life ever voting for a Republican. He also said on Twitter that he was asked if he'd be voting for a Republican in 2024. He cryptically said TBD, and then he was asked who he liked, and he said DeSantis.
Yeah.
So
is this the beginning of the coveted Elon Musk bump? Is he controlling the airwaves through Twitter and also our political futures?
I mean, he's just he's the main character that like Republican or conservative news consumers need now that Trump is kind of exiting the stage as the guy. It's his turn in the spotlight, and he is both becoming associated with the conservative tribe, and also I think deliberately catering it to a great extent.
What do you think that's about? What's the chicken and the egg of that here? Do you think, because I've observed this phenomenon, I've observed it in my personal life, that if you say anything that is at all validating to a conservative worldview, let's say they embrace you, they pull you in, and we saw this with Joe Rogan.
Absolutely.
Joe Rogan endorsed Bernie Sanders, and Lib said, "Oh, I hate you, you're a right winger." Right. But the conservatives, he says anything that's at all, whether it's the anti-vax stuff or whatever, that's even remotely aligned with the majority view on the right, and they embrace him and bring him in, and he goes further and further in that direction. Is that what's happened with Elon Musk? Or do you think he has real ideological commitments here?
I think it is frustratingly and increasingly hard to be not wholly part of one tribe or the other now. We're all kind of pretty accurately sorted. The era of, the conservative Dem who votes for Republicans, sometimes maybe a Republican president, but mostly votes for Democrats locally, or the opposite, a Republican, but darn it, John Kennedy is handsome on TV, so I'm voting for him. Like, that's over. That doesn't happen. Yeah. You just vote for your person. It's hard to be someone, and I speak with some experience as someone with libertarian views that sometimes fit into what liberals think and sometimes fit into what conservatives think. The overriding temptation is just to fully commit to one side or the other and reap the rewards of being part of a team and a tribe and having one media environment play defense for you. And Musk is a very important and wealthy and influential person, and the value of wholly committing to one side or the other is then you do have people coming to your defense. Right now, the entire conservative media establishment wants to defend and protect Elon Musk. And a lot of other business figures go the other way. They find the Republican, they don't like the Republican Party, or they don't like some of its values, so they have to be part of the other side. And then you get more committed to, you know, whatever, the Democrats are good and Trump is evil and that kind of thing.
What do you think this means for third-party efforts like Andrew Yang's Forward Party? Is there an appetite for that right now?
Certainly there's an appetite for it. I absolutely think if you just talk to people, the appetite for third parties is huge, but the structural problems for third parties just cannot be overcome. I wish they could be overcome. We need ranked choice voting, we need proportional kind of electoral and other kinds of things, but that would involve, you know, the two parties who control our government would have to concede to structural changes that will weaken their death grip.
Speaking of COVID, White House infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci has tested positive for the virus. According to the NIH, Fauci is only experiencing mild symptoms and is being treated with Paxlovid, adding that he will isolate and continue to work from home. They also said Fauci has not been in close contact with the president.
Some have pointed to the timing of Dr. Fauci's diagnosis. The twice-boosted doctor was set to testify in front of the Senate Health Committee today. Senator Rand Paul, who was previously sparred with Dr. Fauci, sits on that committee. Dr. Fauci will now be participating virtually, and of course, we wish him speedy recovery. He's very, very vaccinated, so he's just expected to have only mild disease. I can't help but think, though, you know, look, he was very cautious, most probably mask-wearing public official there is. Still got it. Still got it.
Robbie, you're you're an intelligent person.
Okay.
You know.
I don't like where this is going.
You know that the logic isn't that if you are safe, that means you absolutely will never get COVID.
Yeah, because
it
you
means
will
you lower the odds that you're going to get it or get it as regularly. And I was frankly surprised to learn that this was the first time that he's gotten it all of COVID. Most folks, especially folks who are, you know, going into an office every day, I feel like have already succumbed.
Yeah. Because everybody has or will get it. It's not I'm not speaking to you. I'm speaking to
who has not yet gotten COVID.
Well, your time will come, my friend. Your time will come. It's not avoidable. Look, it's not a moral failing.
It's not a moral failing, and I'm not morally superior for not having gotten it. I've said repeatedly that I think that there are things about my life that make it easier for me to avoid COVID. I don't live with anybody, yada, yada, yada. I haven't been going into an office until coming here to Rising.
Yeah.
All of
you sit next to me now, so you've upped your risk profile considerably.
I am aware. But all that being said, I don't know, there is something a little frustrating about the idea that, you know, this is going to be used as proof positive that the kinds of safety measures that he's been recommending don't work to minimize your risk of getting COVID or make it so that you don't get it as frequently as some people have gotten it.
I totally take that point, but some people act as if, right, it's the end of the world. Still, like the long COVID type people, and which, you know, it can be a concern, but it's not. What can you do? You can't stop yourself from getting it.
What are the long COVID type people? Are you skeptical that long COVID is a disease or something that we should be concerned about?
I'm skeptical that it's as pervasive and serious as people claim, because people are very bad at self-diagnosis, and some of the studies so far have suggested people complaining about long COVID symptoms. Some of them hadn't even had it. Now, I'm not saying it's made up or it's in your head, or certainly there are long-running complications you can have from a respiratory disease. Probably that's probably true of past diseases, or even the flu, regular things we've been dealing with for a long time. You can be enduringly ill, and it be hard to explain. I mean, there's debates still about the reality of some disease, with this Lyme disease, or what Ross Douthat wrote about in his book. Well, it's right. People have different opinions about this. My point was not to call that into question, but you can't avoid COVID. You can reduce you maybe delay, and it was great we could really delay it until people were vaccinated because it wasn't as contagious, but now it's so contagious. The newer variants are more easily spread. When the wave comes through, everybody gets it except the absolute shut-ins.
I think all of that is true, which is, I think, a reason why people are not as able to rely on herd immunity as they once thought they would be, and why masking and other kinds of interventions that people want to take on their own volition make more sense now than they perhaps have even in the recent past. I don't think masks make more sense now. If herd immunity isn't as protective as it used to be, then I think that people are going to be less reliant on the idea that I'm probably not going to get it because I've gotten it recently. Because some of the studies that show that the newer variants just basically aren't as resistant to the antibodies people have built up in the past. It would make me, like, I remember when we first got boosted last summer, I really felt like vaccine boosted, it was free reign to go out into the world. Like, I really felt safe and protected in a way that is not really the case anymore. Now I feel like, well, if I get exposed to it, it's a high likelihood that I'm actually going to get it, as opposed to...
Well, because you haven't had it yet. I know you can get it again, but having had it does provide some protective immunity.
And we should do a segment on that.
Nobody knows exactly how much. Even the experts
But the recent studies show that getting COVID is now less protective than they thought with respect to the recent variants. But I don't want to get too many into the details of that because we don't have, that's not a segment we're doing right now. But the point of the matter is, people have the individual choice to do what they're going to do. I think masking makes more sense now that your natural immunity is not as protective as people once thought it was. But the real question I want to ask you is, how big of a risk of long COVID does there have to be for you to think that people are reasonable and wanting to protect themselves? Because I know that a lot of people had risks about the vaccines themselves, some of which are legitimate with the cardiological issues and things like that happens. But those are also in a very small percentage of the population, and frankly, a smaller risk than people who actually get COVID have those same kinds of long-term heart issues. So if that small risk is enough for people to have legitimate concerns about getting the vaccine, why is it that perhaps a similarly small risk of having long COVID isn't enough to make people want to be protective about the prophylactic things they can do to prevent?
Well, obviously, I think in both cases it should be your choice. You should do whatever is right for you. But you can choose to not get the vaccine. I'm saying you can't really choose to not get COVID. And people need to get out of the mindset that it is this
framing,
that this is an avoidable thing. It's not avoidable.